I'd like to call to order the Whatcom County Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force Steering Committee meeting for August 12th, 2021. It is just a little after 11 a.m. and we're meeting virtually. Before we begin, we're going to do a little land acknowledgement. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. So welcome everyone. Happy August. Happy, going to be a warm one today. We're going to shift our agenda around a little bit, and we're going to do number 6, which is the Government Alliance on Racial Equity membership discussion with Gordon Goodwin. We're going to do that first. And so I will turn it over to Gordon, and you can lead us through this. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you very much. And thank you, commissioners, for allowing me the opportunity to explain the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a program of Race Forward, which is one of our nation's larger racial justice organizations. I understand that some of you may have had an opportunity to participate in one of our GARE information sessions. So you have some very basic information on the network and the size of the network, which is cresting upwards of about 320 jurisdictions right now. And by jurisdictions, what that means is that there are counties, cities, some regional forms of government or COGS, as well as independent departments of government and some governmental entities such as park systems and library systems, subsets of government as well. So one thing I also want you to understand is that I think that it is your intention to try to convince not just the particular commission itself, but the county to actually become a member. And would be glad to answer any questions you have about how GARE operates and what sort of the strength of GARE is. One thing I'll explain to you is that GARE is actually a movement of racial equity practitioners who are working in government. While membership is actually done through entities, a lot of the focus of our work, which is really around the normalizing aspects. So for instance, you opened with a land acknowledgement today. Land acknowledgements are an acknowledgement of the history of our nation, a history that is significantly has left out aspects of land taking, of slavery, of other acts that have actually been instrumental in creating the nation, but also have been really illustrative of the ways that government as a foundational institution, something that we all rely on, has played a role in contributing to the racial inequities that we have today. So that normalizing aspect, being able to have that as a conversation and acknowledge it, is actually very important for how we begin to enter into an understanding about why government should really be involved in doing the work of racial equity. That's never more important than it is today, where there are significant efforts afoot to make it illegal to even bring up the issue of race within a government setting. And that has to do with some of the efforts that are being taken by state legislatures, as well as by school boards and other types of elected bodies in sort of having anti-critical race theory types of legislation passed, which is, honestly just about making it banning the words that make it possible for us to talk about race. You can see some information that we're sharing broadly with the public about a banned words campaign on our website. It's a crucial aspect to doing this work and doing it well, because if we can't actually acknowledge the truth of our history and all facets of it, then we can actually begin to understand why government should play a key role in undoing racism, and taking a close look at its practices and procedures that actually contribute or continue to contribute to racialized outcomes, even though they may not be intended, right? So that's an important aspect of our work, is how jurisdictions begin to do the work of change so that they can actually do other work like racial equity analysis, which is a data-informed process of how we are going to take a look at the data that we have in our communities that begin to show us who is significantly underserved, who is significantly at risk, who is currently burdened with racial inequities or lack of access to housing, because the connection to race and the connection with poverty and low income is significant, but there's also a significant overlap with low income white populations as well, right? So if we begin to take a look at our data, and if we begin to take a look at what our mission as a government is, and see that there are people who are not being served, and understand that when we start doing a root cause analysis, that we can't attribute all of those disparities simply to the fact that some people may not be as prepared to take advantage of those programs, that there may actually be some other types of barriers in the way. And some of those barriers might actually be the way that we do government. Fines and fees, complaint-based systems, which tend to focus on maybe one or two languages, or sometimes be very invisible to people who need to access them. Even some of the practices that we have about how we're going to charge for certain types of services, which may actually prevent people from participating, which is one of the reasons that you're seeing the sweeping work around reducing fines and fees in libraries, which is also expanding to other aspects of government, because we realize that the fines and fees are not the things that actually contribute to people complying, right, with what it is that we want for them to participate in order for them to be safe, in order for them to be educated, in order for them to gain access to employment, or to have housing. So taking a look at what our practices are, having community participation in doing that racial equity analysis, particularly in the root cause analysis, so that the everyday experience that those who are most significantly impacted are having shows up in our analysis, that's crucial. Because oftentimes we're doing this type of thinking behind the four walls of what's taking place in our governmental systems. And we don't have the insights of people who are trying to be better served by government, or who may not even be aware that some of our programs exist. We just don't have the input from them, so we don't have the insight. So we come to our own conclusions about what needs to be changed. And we're not actually involving those who are closest to the problem so that we can get a better solution. That's an important aspect of this work, as is having the infrastructure, the change teams in place within government to move the work forward. Those are some of the key pieces around the normalizing of conversations about race and having a shared set of understandings and terminology to talk about race. The organizing aspect of the work, which is how we begin to bring together groups of people in government to help us make the change. and to have the infrastructure in place to move the change forward, the operationalizing aspect of using racial equity tools or racial equity analysis, and putting together racial equity action plans that begin to be incorporated into the other types of planning that we do, like budget planning, like the planning that we do for land use, all aspects of the work we do within government. And then also the important aspect of having a shared vision about what our communities can look like, how they can perform, how they'll be better if we have a reduction or eliminate racial inequities and racial disparities. So that's key to the work that we're doing. The focus of that work is on those who are working within government, racial equity practitioners, and the support network involves peer-based support, some workshops that we host as well, and then bringing together, increasingly bringing together those who are in the network for exchanges of information about what it is that they're trying, or what's working, what's not working, and how we strategize together to move the work forward, with a very keen understanding that the work that we're doing has benefits for all of us. And this is an important aspect of the work that needs to be talked about, is that when we begin to have more accessible government for those who are most significantly impacted by racial inequity and lack of access to government services, we're going to invent better working government for everyone. That's really the broader piece here. So I'd like to take any questions that you might have about how we do our approach and what types of ways we bring folks together. We just had our GARE membership meeting in May. It was an online event. It's the largest GARE gathering that we've ever had. There were 1,500 participants in that, and we're in the process of planning our meeting for next year, where we're anticipating over 2,000 participants. We'll probably be ending up somewhere around 2,500. So that's a nice challenge to have. But we also bring together the membership on a monthly basis for our monthly membership meetings, which are online and exchanges, as well as for webinars. I'm in the process of planning a webinar series now for the American Recovery Plan Act. That's going to have a focus on how some of those monies can be used to actually rethink how we do policing, and how we begin to work further upstream of courts and policing, to start thinking about ways, other systems that need to be engaged to prevent people from having to be incarcerated. We'll have a portion of that focus on water access, because many communities are dealing with the challenge that Flint was dealing with, that you have lead water supply lines that have not been replaced since houses have been built. How do we use some of these ARPA monies to begin to ensure that all children and all families are safe, with safe potable drinking water? We'll also have a portion of that focus on investment in small businesses and what localities and states can do to encourage using some of these monies for minority and women-owned businesses, and what can be helpful in that regard. And that's largely going to be the structure of those sessions. So what questions can I answer for you about GARE? And for the record, I should have started out just by saying I'm Gordon Goodwin and I'm the GARE director. Yes, Mike.
First, I'd like to thank you for personally attending our meeting. It's really appreciated. I was the one that probably peppered your staff with 10 emails, so my apologies. I've been a strong proponent, but I consider myself a student in the area of racial equity. So I think that's one of the reasons why GARE, we have adopted, by the way, formally using the GARE toolkit, but realizing that doing that in a cohort of other people who are we're also students learning, and maybe a couple of experts could really help us move the needle. So I want to thank you personally for attending today. I did attend one of the sessions. I found it really interesting. And one of the aspects was your cohort model. And I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit, there were some specific cohorts. You had one that was looking at, at financial aspects. And obviously this group that you're speaking with today is really centered on, reducing and preventing incarceration. Well, we also want to make sure that we're not impoverishing people. So we have, limited financial obligations, cash bail issues. So we have financial aspects of criminal justice. And I'm curious about the cohort, and would the issues that we're wrestling, would we find one, others wrestling with the same issues? Two, what do you think we might find in terms of mutual support and helping each other as jurisdictions move the needle in that area?
Thank you for your question, Mike. So there are actually court systems that are involved in GARE, as well as prosecutors' offices and some police departments of jurisdictions as well. So as well as, when you start, while we don't have educational systems, there are other aspects of, I guess, what I would call the incarceration pipeline that are also touched by GARE. I think you would find that in our criminal justice and policing working group, there are a number of jurisdictions that are working on these issues. You would also find that we have had a number of different topics that we've covered over the past year. Everything from having jurisdictions begin to define what it means to be actively taking a look at decarceration, as well as alternatives to incarceration. And then thinking about what are some of the responses or ways that we need to interrupt response that only goes to 911 and elicits, say, a police response, to either changing and informing 911 about other options that are available, or, as some communities are doing, taking a look at different types of response altogether, including emergency response for someone's having a mental health crisis. So all of those ideas are very much in the mix in all of our meetings, and we've had several special presentations on those as well, both from large cities and counties, as well as from some smaller jurisdictions too. So I think you'd be quite welcome to be a part of that conversation. It is a pressing conversation for every jurisdiction in America.
Stephen.
Thank you, Barry. Mr. Goodwin, I had the pleasure of being on one of those introductory sessions. One of the things that we appreciated in adopting the Racial Equity Toolkit was its consistency with our charge from our county council, which was to be evidence-based. So both in the formation of policy and in the accountability side, the evaluation of effectiveness, we turn to data to try to assess that. And as you probably know as well as we do in the criminal legal system, data is one of the Achilles heels of this work. It either doesn't exist or it doesn't transfer between agencies, from prosecution to law enforcement to the incarceration system, or between levels of courts. And yet the Racial Equity Toolkit calls for us to be driven by data in making policy decisions. So we were attracted by the analysis that the toolkit would force us through. We feel stymied by the complexity of building a data system that has never existed and that involves multiple jurisdictions. I think we're hoping that somehow working with other localities Somebody may be ahead of us on this, and there may be some information. I'm just wondering what kind of conversations are taking place within the collaborative, or whether there are resources that you're familiar with or jurisdictions you could put us in touch with that would move us forward in the area of data-informed decision-making.
So one of our partners is an organization called ESRI. ESRI is ArcGIS, and it's one of the key contractors for government for data use and mapping. And ESRI has been working with several GARE jurisdictions using the racial equity toolkit and some of the data sets that we've recommended and taken that further. They're actually developing some real-time decision-making tools that can be used to help us better understand, how much are we spending on policing? What are some of the alternatives? What are some of the things we're not spending money on that actually might begin to help us have less of a reliance on policing? And they're beginning to aggregate some of the data sets across platforms that typically don't talk to one another to make them visible. It's making the invisible visible as part of what their charge is, so that these systems become better informed about where they are overlapping and where there are no connections at all, right? And so that's been an effort that's been going on for about the past year. And ESRI just had its national conference, I believe about maybe 2 weeks ago, where some of the GARE jurisdictions that are involved in that work, and I can get a list of them to share with you, are actually doing some of that work with public safety. Now, Douglas County, the Douglas County, and this is Douglas County, Kansas, prosecutor's office is doing some work, getting ready to do some work with us and with I think it's Northwestern University, but it's the law school by the same name out of Boston, which has been aggregating some data for them. And they have been using a cross-platform approach as well. I'm sure you have probably become familiar with the fact that getting the data people to the table and asking the right questions about, first of all, getting to the table is one major challenge, because oftentimes they don't think that they have a role to play in this. But then having them do the data aggregation and disaggregation, and then finding some comparables in terms of a geographic, pull, sometimes is one of the big challenges. So if you've been able to get them to the table, that's great. If you don't have a local organization that's a data services organization that can begin to pull together some data sets that can begin to clarify some things, that may be an opportunity to have some work done with ESRI or with another institution to do that. Vera Institute for Justice, for instance, is one of the entities that we're also doing some work with. Both, we had them as they hired Race Forward to help them do some work internally on their own systems and structures for racial equity, but then also have been a partner with us on some external projects as well. So, and they have a fair number of different entities that they're working with, some of whom are GARE jurisdictions. We're also are aware that several of the jurisdictions within GARE do work with MacArthur Foundation. And we are in a conversation now with MacArthur Foundation about how some of that work comes to live at GARE as part of a learning cohort. So what's important about this is there's information exchange and sharing is the currency of how the learning occurs in those. But then also having some way of tracking some data, some indicators, something that we're going to track to help us understand whether or not things like diversion are actually working because we're getting people participating at every opportunity, and that race is not playing a factor in whether or not people are participating. That's going to be part of how that effort plays out. Because we just having options available, we know that's simply not enough. We know that once you start taking a look at the data about who has access to an opportunity and who's not participating in that, that's where the questions have to start about why is this happening? But the finding occurs at the level of, do we have the data to even show who's participating and disaggregate that by race, gender, zip code, language spoken at home, other key factors. Thanks for asking that question. There's a lot going on in that space. And the GARE community is a place where being open to that level of inquiry so that we can all be more accountable for government being a servant for all of us, right? Is where that is a key piece of how that work is being undertaken.
Hey, Gordon, we're in the midst of putting together a racial equity commission here in Whatcom County. And we're in the kind of the design phase, and it's really a community-led process. So my question is, and when we're engaging the public heavily on getting input, have you had any experience with this kind of formation work? And could you maybe, if there's any tips for success or on the other side of the coin, tripping hazards that we might want to be aware of?
I would encourage you to take a look at the work that took place in Asheville, North Carolina, and the work that's currently underway in Charleston, South Carolina. When commissions are formed, the broadness of the scope sometimes can be helpful. Sometimes, though, there needs to be a little bit of direction. So one of the things that has been helpful is actually putting together a timeline of jurisdictional contributions to racial inequity, jurisdictional contributions to racial equity. And in the case of Charleston, you can go back to the formation of, even before the formation of the country, Charleston was a net importer of slaves, right? For Asheville, North Carolina, they basically went back to the beginnings of the founding of the states. And what they found is that there were they just really documented what happened. What that does with the full support of elected officials is it becomes a community education opportunity. Because when people say things like, well, slavery ended a long time ago, and well, we know that there were Native people here, but there's a lot of questions as to what happened and what the role of, wasn't that all just the federal government that did these things to them? That really wasn't us. We don't really own that. It becomes very clear what the level of ownership is. It also becomes very clear who was able to participate in the economy and who was not, who was able to participate in the civic space and who was not. Why certain parts of town are the way they are in terms of investment and why some are not. Why, in some parts of town we have a lot of amenities and why in some parts of town we don't. And that story really is very much not just linked to the incidents themselves, but sometimes the narratives that then really flesh out the details. Because there are often still people living in our communities who remember these things that happened. And so what that does is it becomes an opportunity for a public acknowledgement of what happened and why we have the types of racial inequities that we have today. Given that level of understanding, people then begin to see, well, maybe there is something we should be doing, right? And that then provides the opportunity for the commission to make some suggestions about ways that government might be able to, and other institutions, because government is not alone in this, but it is a key foundational institution. Ways that governments might be able to start exploring some of the things it needs to do to acknowledge what happened, which is important for having some level of atonement. The process, you can't get to atonement without acknowledgement that there's some wrong that occurred. And then to start having a conversation about, so now that we know that these things happened, we've acknowledged them, what is it that we are prepared to do in order to make things better for the future for all of us? And in the case of Asheville, in the case of Evanston, Illinois, which also has been a part of this movement, and I think soon to be in Charleston, there have been conversations about reparations. There's been a focus on if housing is an area that we really want to think about, maybe we need to start thinking about how we use that low-income housing fund that we've set up. Maybe we need to start thinking about how local governments and banks begin to create more opportunities for people to be housed. And maybe there's some other things we need to explore in terms of how government operates. They're actually contributing to people not being able to be a full part of our community. So I think that the charge needs to be thoughtfully thought about in terms of sort of the broadness and the reach, but also give time to the commission to put together a work plan about what it will actually do to create a learning opportunity for the entire community. Because those meetings were open to the public. And when it becomes a public sort of acknowledgement of this is the work that we're doing, and then an opportunity to share that work, it becomes a good opportunity for press coverage and for raising a level of awareness that then leads to a level of public willingness to even entertain a conversation about what we could possibly do differently. I hope that's helpful. And I'd love to connect you with some folks who could tell you more about those, because there are gaffes that happen along the way in terms of even the notion that government is now all of a sudden deciding that it wants to explore this.
Thank you for that. Sure. Dan.
Hey, this is Dan Hamill. I'm a Bellingham City Council member from the ward that represents downtown Bellingham and some of the neighboring neighborhoods. I wanted to just mention that I am helping to lead the way on creating a resolution that acknowledges that racism is a public health risk and threat. In that resolution, we acknowledge the atrocities that happened in Bellingham, including the 1907 running Sikh people out of the town, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. There's also a link in the resolution to a land deed that specifically excludes people of color from living in a very wealthy area in our community unless they're servants. So we're acknowledging that, and I'm working towards, I guess, to kind of dismantle the system of white supremacy locally through zoning, and also making it available, making medium or lower cost housing generally available in all neighborhoods in the form of accessory dwelling units. We have a housing problem in Bellingham as well as up and down the West Coast. I was one of the 3 architects of the Bellingham Home Fund, which raises money for affordable housing. I also led the way, as did Barry Buchanan on the county side, on getting some additional housing dollars to add into that home fund. So, it's a process of acknowledgement to me process of acknowledgement and then dismantling those systems and rebuilding the system to make it more equitable across the board. And housing seems to be at the middle of a lot of these conversations, as well as mental health and access to quality mental health and behavioral health services. And I'm working on various responses, as are many of the people on this call, to provide for better behavioral health services in our community. So I just wanted to put that out there just so you know, Mr. Goodman.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's, we've seen, so one of the first jurisdictions to adopt the American Public Health Association's acknowledgement that racism is a public health crisis was Milwaukee County. And I did a fair amount of work with Milwaukee County 2 years ago. The acknowledgement of that then, of course, becomes a public facing acknowledgement, which of course then increases the level of expectation that in fact, something will be done. And that's, I think, a good thing, because one of the things that's important about this work is that there be some level of public facing commitments about the fact that we know that we know our history, we know that these conditions still exist. They didn't end because we changed laws. And here are some of the things now that you should be prepared to see us do, which I think is where some of the legislation then begins to create structures within government that, like chief equity officers, racial equity offices that are attached to the executive branch, even talking about the fact that some of our practices, like our budgeting practices and other types of practices, are going to be under review for how we can ensure the public that we are not continuing to contribute to, unintentionally, but contribute nonetheless, to racial inequities. So thank you. Ms. King, really?
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin, for participating in this meeting. Any information is always greatly appreciated. My question, you just kind of recently touched on it because, you know, we know how history is important in all the aspects, but I recently read a book called The New Trail of Tears by Naomi Schaefer Riley. I'm familiar with the book, but you know, it really talks about how our education system talks about the history of tribes and what happened back then, but it doesn't really talk about what's happening now, cultural differences, ethnic differences. She touched on lock-ins in certain areas where when the welfare checks or the tribal checks went out, that they needed to keep a safe environment for the kids because a lot of times the checks got used in bad areas and then we needed to make sure the kids were protected. And this is real and it's happening now, but it's not something we learn about in school now. I mean, I remember Sitting Bull and Custer's Last Dance, and we had to make teepees and hogans. And I mean, this was a few years back because obviously I've been out of school for a while, but we don't really talk about the here and now, but we just talk about the disparities and the problems that we're facing. Is there a way we can incorporate that more into our education, or do you see it being done and I'm missing it? That's my question.
Well, so one thing I would say is that Native people are here, they're surviving. There are significant numbers of Native people in urban environments. And there's policy reasons for that due to, you know, the efforts to get people off of reservations in the 1950s. But the lack of telling of a full history of the United States and its relationship to Native nations and people is something that is not new. And I think some of the work that was done with an Indigenous people's history of the United States, I think also begins to make some of that history very clear and make very clear connections between past relationship and current circumstances, right? So I think also it would benefit you to have Native-run institutions. If there's a federally qualified health center that significantly serves Native people, if there are other organizations, I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. So Little Earth organization is one that is multi-tribal, but is a significant nonprofit organization that's a housing organization, as well as a community organization that serves Native people. To have leaders and people who are of the First Nations participating in how we teach some of the history about our events, even talking about how the names that we use. And one of the things that's fascinating to me is that Native culture is all around us. I'm less than half a mile away from the Mississippi River, living in a state called Minnesota. These are essentially words, right, that are either, in some cases, Ojibwe, in other cases, they're words from other nations, and we use them all the time. And so nobody even asked a question about where they came from. We recently started in our state, just a couple of years ago, having a full exploration of the so-called Dakota Wars. And some of you may know that in Minnesota, this was the largest mass hanging took place here of Dakota men. Nobody really talks about the fact that one of the people in our state who's attributed as being one of the founders was very closely related to that whole incident in terms of going against treaty rights and actually defrauding Native people of some of the goods and resources that they needed in the dead of winter, which really led to what was called the Dakota Wars. So there's so much history that doesn't get told. And I think that whenever we think about history, we need to remember that it's often told from the perspective of the survivor or those who were the winner of a particular war. And there's often more than one side to it. So I do think that there may be some room in our schools for having that broader history told by having it be more complete with texts like Indigenous people's history of the United States. And then more importantly, bringing in current tribal people to be a part of telling that full history.
Okay, we can do one more question and then we're going to have to get on to the rest of our agenda. So Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. And I had my eye on the clock too, both for our agenda and for Mr. Goodwin's time. Thank you so much for being here. I think at the outset, you correctly identified that one of our goals in meeting with you was to sort of assess the value from our perspective of actually joining as a member of GARE, either the task force or the county council. So I'd like to get practical here and try to hear how, as a member, we would advance some of the goals we've been talking about here. Obviously, the monthly meetings wouldn't be sufficient to actually get work done. So can you share succinctly the nuts and bolts of how collaborations would actually move forward and partnerships and sharing of information might take place?
So one important thing to note is that GARE is undergoing a program redesign right now. And that is because we have over 300 members. We have grown in a relatively short time, in a period of about 5 years, from approximately 14 members to over 300. I think it's about 320 right now. As a result, the things that we used to do are all undergoing a review, and we're actually questioning a lot of our assumptions. What we know will be key for moving forward is an increased, more intensive level of exchange across the network itself. Some of that will be encouraged by us bringing resources to the network multiple times a month. So we already have a couple of different ways that we do that through our GARE 365 webinar series, which is a series that focuses on particular areas of interest. That'll be part of what the American Recovery Plan Act is about. But we also do that through the monthly membership meeting through the GARE member portal, which is an exchange place for how we bring together people around particular areas of interest, fields of interest, as well as having an open platform for exchanging information about resources, and then tracking where there's energy in the network to do a special level of exchange amongst members. So for instance, we've done that with libraries, we've done that with some folks. The ARPA piece came about because members had a lot of questions about it that they weren't getting answered any places and wanted more specific information. And in the working groups. Not all of the working groups are active right now, but those are issue-specific areas where members come together on a monthly or every other month basis to really begin talking about what are some of the things that we're doing that might be imitated, replicated in other areas. How do we start defining a field of practice that really illustrates what racial equity is? And that is all part of what you would be able to participate in. There are some things that are still under development, and part of this plan is to move some of our workshops into more of an asynchronous approach, where there are portions that are online, and then we bring together people either online or in real space to begin not only talking about how they're applying the theory to practice, but also beginning to exchange ideas that will help them further their practice across the network. And so those are things that are sort of in the glimmer of the eye right now, but are taking shape as we go through the redesign process, which will take us through the end of the year, but which we're significantly involved in right now.
Thank you. Well,
And of
thank
course-
you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Of course,
Go
there
ahead.
will be the GARE membership meeting, which is going to be taking place in April. That's all I can say about that right now. We're still selecting the dates next year, but that's the most significant substantive exchange, and we sure hope we'll be able to do it person to person versus, hybrid or, online only.
Boy, isn't that the truth? We're all just dying for that day when we can really feel good about person-to-person meetings. Well, thank you, Gordon, for being with us today. We really appreciate your time and expertise, and wish you well. And we're going to really be looking at this hard, I know, and looking at membership. But again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all very much for allowing me to present to you today, and all the best to you and your work moving forward.
Thanks a lot, Gordon.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we'll move back to the start of our agenda. We had an item on Attorney General information on police reform legislation. Jill, do you know who was supposed to be leading this discussion?
No, I believe Mike and you, Barry, a couple of you were in an email conversation about this. So that's why I added it to the agenda as asked.
Okay. Yeah, my participation in that was just to acknowledge that if there's some new information that we need to disseminate, then we should. I don't have any new information myself. Mike, do you have anything?
I brought it up because it was obviously a pressing and current issue. The task force was kind of having a special meeting in part to kind of address recent law changes, which was really, we're hearing from our law enforcement partners and members of the task force, was really going to stymie efforts to keep us safe and to respond to certain calls. I thought that the Attorney General's memo kind of directly, could could help us maybe through that and have a discussion about what does that do for the task forces? What is the task force's role in terms of maybe convening again with law enforcement to digest that and to get some reaction to it is one of the things that I'm particularly curious about. And I know Stephen might have a thought or two as well. I think he was pretty in favor of us bringing that forward today.
Yeah, Stephen?
Yes, I was. I think we had the legislation, and then we had our local law enforcement's interpretation of that and the effects it would be. And I think the Attorney General's memo speaks directly to law enforcement's interpretation. And so to me, it seemed that it set up a need to push forward, to have a debate, to try to resolve some of these. I mean, law enforcement's view was really their interpretation. It's not even uniform across the state amongst law enforcement agencies. So I thought, without trying to be adversarial about it, I thought it would be important to force the proponents of a certain viewpoint of that legislation to confront the perspectives that were articulated in the memo. And I thought the task force was exactly the right forum, either as the task force or as the Law and Justice Council, however we wanted to headline that. So I was just suggesting we push it into a real a forum of conversation, but I mean meaty conversation where you really had to sort of defend, not just state an opinion. So I know there are a number of task force members who articulated a viewpoint that's different from the AG's memo. Sorry. So I would propose that we devote some time in the task force and do it as soon as possible to that sort of debate.
So that would be something that we would actually put on our next agenda, obviously, the September meeting.
It seems timely to me to do that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Stephen, totally. Arlene? You're muted, Arlene.
This apparent conflict is very concerning to me because I'm absolutely certain that in order to be effective for our people, we need teamwork. That means law enforcement and everybody else, we all need to be on the same team working together to make these changes occur and to do it in a way that's safe. So I guess I really want this discussion because I want to work in that direction towards us being together in what we plan.
Raylene?
I just wanted to concur with Stephen. I think it needs more information from all the players, and I think it does need to be brought back up because there are still a lot of unanswered questions. The fact that this isn't a formal opinion gives me some concern, and there's still questions when we remove reasonable suspicion to only probable cause. There's more concern there. The fact that officers are concerned about doing stuff without risking their certification if they do something wrong, and not having real strong legal opinion is definitely concerning. So I think it does need to be put on the next meeting agenda.
Jack?
I was tempted to have you call on Tyler to make sure I don't disagree with him, but really, I have a little bit of a different approach on this. I feel we're beating a dead horse a little bit here. I'm fine putting it on the agenda, but I think it needs to be framed. We've spent an hour at the task force talking about it. We've had a special meeting where we couldn't get a consensus. If the purpose of discussion is dissemination of information, I think that's fine. But there are some philosophical disagreements within the task force, which is fine. You know, in the 5 or 6 years I've been involved, this is the first time we've really hit that. The challenge of focusing too much on this, though, is we can't do anything else. So I think it was appropriate. We spent most of the last task force meeting about an hour talking about it. I thought it was a good discussion. We heard a lot of good stuff, but I would encourage, unless somebody objects, that Stephen and I put a boundary right up front on, we're going to talk about this for X amount of time. We're going to disseminate whatever information. But if we're hearing the same different perspectives and opinions again, that's fine. But then at some point we need to move on and do other work. So thanks.
Mr. Schroeder.
Yeah, hi group. I was just going to recognize that we've heard from both Rep. Rammel and Rep. Shoemake kind of on the topic, and they may have an interest in providing their background as the legislation was being developed, because they are having concerns as well from what they are hearing on local interpretation. So I just wanted to recognize that if somebody from the group wants to reach out to them, they may have some interest in participating in that conversation.
Cool. And I'll go. You want to do Sharon Berry? You know her well too. But yeah, I think we should have her come.
Yeah, I could get both Sharon and Alex, I'm pretty sure.
And in that case, I would expand the time allotted because that's new information.
Perry.
Really agree with a number of things that were said, and I found myself in just being in a variety of meetings, mostly talking about response to mental health and some of those components, and certainly you know, have an understanding, particularly as Raylene mentioned, from the sort of individual effect on the officer or deputy. But one of the things that's really happened is I've been in some meetings of where Bellingham Police has made statements about what they are able to do and what they are going to continue to do, particularly in response in my given situation to ITAs, to pick up orders, to calls, mental health calls and so forth. And that information doesn't seem to be, you know, sort of held in any one place. There's a lot of different discussions, and then the outcome of that maybe does or does not occur. And again, I'm not sure in terms of the task force, you know, responsibility to that end, but having some kind of definitive documentation about what the commitment is at this point in time, you know, et cetera, would be really helpful, particularly in relation to the items that I mentioned. So I offer that thought.
Anything else on this item? Stephen.
Yeah, I'll just follow up by saying I appreciate Jack's concern with how much emphasis has already gone into this. I'm not interested in rehashing the conversation we had. I'm interested in confronting new information and localized information. And I think Perry brings up a really good point. If there's a way that we can focus this in to something that's definitive and shared across stakeholders, even if it's a temporary thing until we get a formal legal opinion out of the AG's office or the legislators amend the statute or whatever, I think we'll be better off. And some of the innovations and some of the diversion activities we've worked so hard to put into place will be able to go forward instead of being put on pause.
Mike.
You know, when I first heard about this from law enforcement and some of the concerns about their ability to respond, I felt a knee-jerk reaction about my own personal safety. I've had a chance to reflect on that a little bit because I'm a white person. My feeling of safety is a little bit different. And while unfortunately we don't have a person of color that I'm aware of on this call, and if they are, I want to step aside and let them take the stand for a moment. But I just want to mention that you know, I was starting to really think that maybe we were too far ahead with legislation and that we didn't have services. But, you know, when you've experienced what other people have experienced in our community, across our nation, this is timely. This is worth every minute that we will spend talking about it and hashing it out. I am with Jack. I don't want to waste time because we want to be efficient and effective, and that's one of our goals. But I can't say loudly enough how important this conversation is for those with disabilities, with behavioral health challenges, who may not receive interventions and services while we wait to get alternate response teams going. We need our law enforcement. and we need response to issues within the current law. And it seems that the AG is trying to point us to a way forward where both can happen. And that didn't seem entirely possible to me prior, but I think there's a path forward. So I just want to state that I think it is probably one of the most pressing issues that I've seen since being on this task force. And what exactly our role is, I think we're a public meeting. And so Jack and Stephen are co-chairs. I think we have an opportunity to showcase and to have debate and to have discussion. And if we can reach some consensus or we can push some things forward, I think it's just extremely important. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jack.
Thanks, Mike and Stephen. I agree with all those comments, and I think new information is great. I may be a little biased. I was at the county council meeting the other night and listened to 40 minutes of, and I know I'm being recorded, I don't care, what felt to me like wingnut crazy conversations. Now, I'm not saying we're drifting into that, but there's only so much we can do. And I think recognizing we are an advisory body, that we won't always have consensus is okay. I think it's important that all points of view get out. I agree with Mike. There probably isn't a more important issue that affects the goals of the task force right now than this. So my only concern was that we only meet 11 or 12 times a year, that we not dedicate necessarily 1/6 of our group meeting time to this topic solely. And that's the only place I'm coming from. But I do recognize the importance, and I probably shouldn't have given that other example. I don't think we would veer into that, but sometimes in passion and debate and comment, it's easy to lose sight of the prize, of the most important things that we're doing. So thanks.
Okay, anybody else have anything before we move on? Yeah, Mike.
I'm just curious on the action here. Is there an action regarding putting it on the agenda, framing? Is any of that going to take place here? Is that going to take place outside of here? Just curious about our process.
So typically, Mike, what the process is, and we actually initially started this group to get help with the agenda because there was all this pressure. So what's historically been done is Stephen and I, often in consultation with Barry, who we see as our boss, he represents council. Well, Jill usually is smart enough to figure it out and just does it, and we make sure it matches. But I think we would make sure there's enough time for what needs to be said. Certainly if our representatives are there, we're going to give them quite a bit of deference to explain their position. That will likely generate a lot more time for back and forth question and answer, which I think, Stephen, would be appropriate. And that might be different than some of the other ways this might come about. But I would say this will be, probably top of the agenda, high priority, with as much time as necessary, which would be more time if the people who did the legislation are there. Does that match your perspective, Stephen?
Yes, it does, quite closely.
I just wanted to remind you that the next meeting, September, is when we've invited Dr. Alexis Harris to present as well.
Okay.
I think there we have our agenda.
Two items.
Our work just became easy, Stephen.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a good call, Stephen. Okay, let's move on to the task force communications. And I think Mr. Schroeder was going to be involved in this discussion as far as resources and how we might move this forward. So do you want to start us off, Tyler?
I have a little bit of information on guidance from staff in our finance department. We need to define what kind of money we're talking about. There's certain thresholds that require different advertising notices and that kind of thing. So I need to get some feedback from you to find out to find out how much money you're thinking about spending on a communications specialist. That information that we talked about at the past meeting, the draft scope of work, is in your packet on pages 6 and 7. I have that up if you'd like me to screen share it. So that's the first thing that I'm really looking for is just give me some kind of a ballpark of how much money you guys want to spend on this effort.
Anybody have thoughts?
Would other members find it beneficial for Jill to share her screen on that? I know I would.
Yeah, go ahead, Jill.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Similar contracts that other departments have done in the past couple of years. The fees charged for these kinds of efforts has generally been around $220 an hour from people who have responded. So just keep that in mind. I really don't have a good handle on how much it would take for a lot of these things to get done. So if you have any insight on that, that would be helpful as well.
I think that's the $64 million question. Mr. Schroeder.
You know, there has been some examples pretty recently, and maybe Jill reaching out to Ann Beck in the health department, or Tara Sundin at the city of Bellingham. I know they've been looking at some communication efforts surrounding homeless housing as we're moving into the winter and next go around. And my understanding is that was about around $40,000 for their effort. And that would be, I think, for a year, but mostly kind of going into the winter and coming out of the winter. So it wouldn't be as much work like during next summer or not. So that might be a good way to get a sense from a budgeting standpoint, and kind of compare and contrast this work to that work and what it may look like. But I'm uninformed in how long this work is intended to last. So that would be helpful for me to get a better sense, and we could then help put some budget numbers to it.
That was kind of the thought I had too, whether how much ongoing effort we thought we needed.
I think part of the scope of work includes you, this steering committee, identifying however many, 2, 3, 4 specific messages it wants to get out into the community, and then have that contractor craft that message, define the audience, and do all the work necessary to get those messages out into the community, right? So I don't know how long that would take. And then the second part of that would be just to set up systems for us to do ongoing public relations and communications on our own, whether that's creating templates for messaging, whatever needs to be done there. So again, I don't have a good sense of how much time that would take. Tyler, I can definitely look at those contracts again. I've looked at them before. I don't think that I have access to the actual time it took. Maybe I can talk to Ann or Perry if you have that information to find out. But is this group willing to spend that much money? $10,000, $20,000. The threshold for going out for an RFP is $40,000. So I just wanted to get a sense of what you guys are comfortable spending on this kind of an effort.
I think that this issue is so important. I'm not even sure how to say it to you. I guess I've been beating this drum for a fairly long time, but it doesn't do us a lot of good to make important changes, and the community doesn't even know the first thing about what has been accomplished, or even how to get access to the services that are being developed and to understand it. So the beginning of the work would be to design the plan, and would take a lot of hours to do that. And then there needs to be maintenance, because it's not something that you drop in a year if the task force is ongoing, which I assume that it will be. And so then it needs to be either a maintenance contract or, because I think we need the professional ability of this kind of person to be leading. And so I think the spending of the money for it is really important, because this is, to me, this is just an example of a piece of government work that's just missing from our whole community. We don't have it that I've ever seen. And if it's there, I don't know where it is. I haven't seen it. So it's an attempt to get it going. And I hope other people copy.
Stephen.
Thank you, Barry. It's hard for me to wrap my head around costing this out, because I think the draft is a little bit unclear. It talks about a consultant helping us with a strategy, which is not what Arlene just described. She described a whole communication campaign. So is it someone who's setting out a coherent professional roadmap for us that we then pick up the ball and carry out? Is it someone actually writing message content for us, which is not a strategy, it's the actual communication? And doing it over time is not what I read in the draft either. So I think we're mixing apples and oranges there a little bit. And I would say the first thing I would like is for us to clarify what we'd be asking of this person. And then we might be able to make some progress on the cost of it.
Jack?
I almost feel like not speaking. That was perfect, Stephen. And I think Jill or somebody highlighted the part about a defined 3 or 4 or 5 initiatives. So I think the place to start, we know better than an outside person what initiatives, and thank you, Arlene, we've needed this from the beginning. We know what initiatives better than an outside person we think we want the community to hear about. I would suggest we ask our subcommittees to define 1 or 2 items, bring that back to the next task force. That'll give us 5 or 6 things, and then let's figure out scope of work. But it's awfully hard to define the cost until you know what you're trying to communicate. And hopefully there'll be some synergy that you can market, so to speak, some of these initiatives in multiple ways. For example, if it's an email, you can have more than one thing mentioned, or a newsletter, or whatever it is. I can already imagine the Crisis Stabilization Center's initiative would be to communicate the availability of that resource to the community. I mean, I've talked to pastors and counselors and others who have no clue it's there. So I don't think it'll be too hard, but I think that's the next step. Let's have the subcommittees identify 1 or 2, come back, and then maybe engage someone to help us once we say, here's our wish list. I wouldn't pay him to help us do that.
Mike?
Well, I'm going to echo Jack. You both spoke extremely well. I guess I was thinking of kind of and this may be a naive suggestion, but starting with, as Jack is suggesting, some very targeted pieces, and hopefully learn from a person up front what that takes and what that cost is, as opposed to buying an ongoing thing up front when we kind of don't know what that product looks like, what that cost looks like at this point. So it seemed a little premature to say, yeah, I'm comfortable spending this much. I don't know what any amount would buy. And so, Jill, I appreciate your comment that you could look at some examples of what we have spent, and maybe we can compare that against the product. That would certainly make it more comfortable to answer a question, how much are you comfortable to spend? It's what would we get, I think is really important. Jack, I really like your comment. I was also going to suggest that we look to our annual reports, sequential intercept model, in addition to our subcommittees for topic areas that we think are really important. And then I guess a question to Jack, did you think then, Jack, that would come back to steering for finalization and refinement of a scope of work?
I think that would work probably better than the full task force. Just ask the chair. I mean, the chairs are here. The pairs are, just bring it back. I think I think this one will go pretty easy. I think we'll find some, because we're not really going to eliminate things. We're asking you to identify 1 or 2 things. We put them all in the bucket, and as a group, if they look good, we've got it. And if something looks out of place, one of these things is not like the others, we can toss it. But I think it'll be fine.
Okay. Jill?
So I agree with the goals that y'all have stated, and I tried to craft this scope of work accordingly. If it doesn't read that way, please let me know how I can do that better. My two overriding goals here are to using best practices. Number one, develop a specific public relations communications campaign for 2 or 3 or 4 current task force initiatives. So it sounds like you want me to go to the committees and ask them what they think those initiatives should be. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah. I think that's,
Okay.
Yeah, I think they should identify them. They should come to steering committee, and then steering committee will say, we vet these.
Okay, and then the second goal of mine goes to what Arlene said, is to have this communications consultant craft an ongoing future process or strategy or whatever you want to call it that we can then implement ourselves in the future without having to necessarily rely on hiring another communication strategist each time we want to put a message out there in the community. So as far as moving forward, I will schedule that request about the topics for the current initiatives and get that information back to you. I will try to get some information on what past communication strategy efforts have taken in other departments in the county and through the city. And then we'll revisit this scope of work after that's done, probably at the next steering committee. Is that correct?
yeah, I'm pretty sure that's, yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. Stephen?
I hope I'm not screwing this up at this point, but I'd like to make a comment about our request to the subcommittees. And I'm building off the experience I had, and Jack, tell me if yours was similar, when we spoke to Bellingham City Council and the County Council for the annual report. I found them as interested in what we thought we needed to do in the future as what we have already done. And clearly they're more informed than the general population. But I'm wondering if it would be valuable to ask the subcommittees also to try to highlight maybe one area that they think is most important for them to concentrate on in the next year or year and a half or something like that, so that the public in these communications would also have a sense of where our priorities are and where we think this work needs to go. That seems like being ahead of rather than looking back at our work.
So Stephen, you're suggesting we ask them to identify a single goal that we would communicate as part of the strategy, right?
Yeah, maybe one thing that they want the community to know most that we've accomplished, and one thing that we are emphasizing, we want them to pay attention to for the future.
Mr. Schroeder?
I was just going to offer assistance to Jill as we move forward, and if there needs to be discussion on budget allocation and what budget the council office currently has and what steps to need to take to carry this out.
Thanks, Tyler. We appreciate that. Mike?
Yeah, I had a question, and it's probably most appropriate for Deputy Executive Schroeder, but part of this, as Jill kind of iterated, is capacity building, right? We want to get a product that we can then do, maybe on our own and maybe not hiring that consultant on an ongoing basis. That appeals to my fiscally prudent side. I like that. The thing is, though, is where does that capacity get built? And Deputy Executive Schroeder, I remember at one time we had on offer, I believe, the services of some communication specialists that the county employs. Would that be the spot maybe for this capacity building or communication tool, vehicle, whatever we want to call it, where that would live? And then if that is the case, should that somehow be maybe made formal or included in the scope of work? What are your thoughts on that piece? Who might be actually penning these future communications in our newly built vehicle?
Jill, did you have a initial response, or would you like me to take?
My initial response is that's a great question, because I was wondering what of that future work we could maybe tap into Jed to help us with. It would be great if we can do some of that. I think it's going to be a variety of different sources, Mike. I can do some of that stuff if we are have Jed available to us, and he can do some of that. So I think it's just going to kind of be parceled out a little bit and maybe spread out so it's not all on one person. That's how I had envisioned it.
Yeah, after hearing the background and the wants, I totally agree. I think there'd be some capacity in our office to help from a communication specialist standpoint once there's kind of a plan in place. And I really like putting a plan together, but having us carry it out because it probably won't change, and you don't have to have an ongoing contract associated with it. So.
And in addition, Ann Deacon is putting together that communications roster that maybe we can pull from as well in the future too.
Yep. So as it gets defined, I think we'll be able to find a good foundation for the effort moving forward.
Okay, folks, I have a hard stop at 12:30, so I wanted to get to the amendment to the decision-making piece before I have to leave anyway, and turn it over perhaps to someone else. But let's move there. Let's move to the, Jack, you're the one that brought this up.
Sure. Let me be very brief. For the first time in our task force's history, we had a decision that was very close, that because of the way our parliamentary process is defined, had some ambiguity. So I don't think anyone has too big of heartburn about what process we use, as long as that process is consistent. But both Stephen and I feel we need a consistent process. Mayor Kortheis pointed out that, in his opinion, our process probably didn't follow our process. I, from a parliamentary perspective, tend to agree with them. However, no one's asking that we revisit it, but we do need to clarify. Jill suggested, well, I don't know if Jill suggested, Jill advised that most county committees and groups operate under a system where a majority is a majority of the total membership, not a majority of a quorum. So the issue here was often it's a majority of a quorum that makes a decision. So if you have 20 members, but only 15 are present, 8 are a quorum. But if you had 20 members and only 15 were present and used the system often used by the county, you would need 11. So it's a higher bar. I think for an advisory group, personally, philosophically, I think it's fine. The bar's higher. I don't have a strong opinion, but our current rules are a little ambiguous. Well, if anything, I think they would suggest that it's a quorum present. So we can debate that a little bit. So the question would be, Jill kindly constructed some potential revisions to our very simple rules of order that would define decision-making when it is close to be, or when there's not unanimity, that it would be defined by a 51% of total membership as opposed to 51% of quorum. So the question for all of you really is if anyone has a problem with that or prefers it to be 51% of the quorum. I can go either. I typically prefer 51% of quorum, but given this is an advisory group and that the county tends to operate groups with 51% of the total, I think that's fine. So that's where we are.
The one thing that concerned me in addition to that was the, I think one of the votes, the majority was abstentions. And that really kills us if we have a lot of members
Sure.
that feel they can't vote and they want to abstain. Well, as you all know, that really gets tallied as a no vote.
Well, abstentions are always a no vote unless you institute something called present not voting, which eliminates them from quorum or membership. So I think, but I don't think, Barry, this will be a common problem for us given the history. It's only happened once. And I believe actually, in most cases, often the abstentions are judicial people that are taking those positions because of their positions. So, but still, you only need 51%. So even if you have 5 dropping out for judicial reasons, you probably wouldn't have more than 5 or 6. If you have most of your membership there, you should be fine. So, I mean, like I said, my personal preference is 51% of a quorum present, but I happily defer to the council and Jill's experience and others, and I'm fine with 51% of total membership. I don't think it matters, but we do need to make a recommendation and we do need to take it to the task force because it needs to be defined.
Raylene?
I didn't realize on the abstention because I had serious concerns about voting on that with position and judicial. So I don't know if there's a way to change that or to let the judicial officers not count if they feel that they should be abstaining from the voting on certain topics.
There definitely is a way, but it starts getting convoluted. I mean, I think if this were a regular occurrence, we could absolutely do that. What I've commonly seen is in addition to abstention, a category called present, not voting, which eliminates that individual. I don't know if that's from Sturgis or if it's from Rogers, but I have seen that used. But again, we've only had it happen once in 5 years.
That's a good point. Maybe we should just kind of keep that in our back pocket, knowing that.
Yeah, so I think simple is better for now, but if it became a regular thing, I would absolutely concur to allow a category that's an abstention that doesn't, abstentions are a no vote because you need 51% in favor. So by definition, if you abstain, it's not in favor.
You're lopping off that opportunity for a favorable vote, right? Mike?
Just 2 cents. I'm hearing from Jack. It could kind of go either way. I can see merits. It seems that practice, though, or praxis of what we have been doing has been a lot more towards the 51% of quorum. There are a lot of members, I believe, of this task force who don't make regular attendance and might not even be up on a particular issue. However, there are others that come regularly and are present for that quorum. So just based on that alone, for my 2 cents, I would say 51% of quorum seems to make more sense the way we operate. Thanks.
I agree with that myself. I think it's a better idea.
Okay. I mean, it's slightly my preference. The only reason I'm advocating for the other, it's my understanding that a lot of county commissions run that way, but I like 51% of quorum. I think it's a more effective way to do business.
So is that something we want to propose then at the next task force?
If no one objects, we would ask Jill to make some very simple edits to our rules of order, Steve, and then you and I can look at them, and then we would make a recommendation that steering committee discussed. We're recommending this change to clarify, and we would adopt that as our operating rules.
Do we want to?
Is that right, Jill? Did I get it right?
Yes, that's correct.
So do we want to make that recommendation as a result of an action we take here, or a consensus we have here, or?
Well, how about this? Does anyone at this steering committee object that's to proposing we use 51% of quorum? We can simply not take action and say there was no objection at steering committee unless someone objects. Are you object, Arlene? Okay. So
I have to go. Guys, okay. I have to go. So I'm going to turn this meeting over to the co-chairs.
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you all later.
Thanks, Barry.
So I'm going to jump in, Jack. I'll need to check because I'm not as familiar with Roberts, but I believe that if we're going to follow Roberts, which the current bylaws say that any procedure, any rule change, any bylaw change requires 2/3 approval of the whatever the quorum is, which is currently all the members. I will check that just to make sure, but I just wanted you to be aware that's kind of rattled.
Yeah, to adopt this, we'll need to have plenty of, it was unanimous the first time. Roberts does allow you to supersede Roberts with your own rules in many cases, but I would say the initial vote on this should be 2/3 of quorum to approve it. I would agree, because that's bullet.
Comment? Dan?
Just so I can understand properly, when you say 51% of quorum, does that mean quorum present?
Yes.
Quorum, okay, gotcha.
Quorum, for the way I'm using it, is present, only present. So the quorum, typically in Roberts, quorum is the members of the committee that are present at that time. And typically a quorum requirement is set at maybe 51% of the total membership, or whatever the quorum guideline is. 51% would be common.
There are different rules in in Roberts though for different types of bodies. And according to this body that the task force operates under, those rules per Roberts right now require a quorum of the total membership minus the vacant positions. Okay, so to change the current bylaws right now would require, if it's a 2/3 or 51%, whatever it is, of the current membership minus the vacant positions.
Agreed.
I will double check on whether it's 51% or 2/3 and let you know.
Given that Jill needs to go back and dig into this a little bit more, and the fact that we're dealing with a situation that came up for the first time in 6 years, is there any reason why we might not want to just defer this to the next steering committee meeting, hear from Jill on what she's dug up, and come to a decision on a recommendation at that point?
I think that's a perfect idea. I don't think this is pressing. No one's asking us to revisit our decision. And yeah, Jill, if you could do, excuse me, a little more research, including your perspective of, my perspective of what we would need to adopt new rules of order would be to take the most conservative approach. Often there are parliamentarians that advise you, but in this case, I think just making it bulletproof, whatever it is, and it's likely 2/3 of our total membership is the safe thing to do. We can say that's the bar we're looking for to adopt our new rules, and this committee can make a recommendation or not once we get there. And again, I don't see it as really right or wrong, no matter which way we go, but we should, this revealed a hole in our process that came up for the first time that needs to be remedied. So I think it's next steering committee, because we're going to be busy with other stuff at the next meeting anyway.
So I think we're out of time, and unless there's something somebody feels some urgency to bring up at this point, maybe we should just adjourn here.
Just ask Jill can meet me afterwards for just a second.
And Arlene, sometime tell me what your objection is. We can talk offline, but I'm just curious. I think I may know, but I'd like to know for sure and not guess and speculate, because maybe we can integrate your concern into a solution. So
Sometime.
okay, all right, thank you, Arlene.
And Jill, I reached out to Ann Beck in regards to the communications specialist, just to send you some additional information. I'll take care of that. You don't have to do anything.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Perry. I appreciate it.
Jill, would you, in preparation for the next task force meeting, would you jog Barry's memory to contact Representative Shoemake and Representative Hamill to make sure they can participate?
Yes, it's on my to-do list. Thank you.
Okay, Jack, if you're okay.
Take us out, Stephen. Take us out.
I saw Mike about to make a comment, so give him one last chance.
Just really briefly, just go to the order. Thank you all for inviting Gordon Goodwin here today. I really appreciate the interest, the good questions, hearing it out. Obviously, I really hope that this group adopts it. I hope that the county council adopts it. But I really appreciate everybody's continued interest in this. And Jill, thank you for getting somebody from GARE to join us today. Hopefully that was what we needed to move the needle. Thank you all.
Okay, and with that, we'll adjourn the steering committee meeting. See you all soon.